Carla. Okay, so my name's Megan, and I am the moderator for today's panel. I just graduated from Rosemont in May with a double degree, so I have the creative writing and publishing masters. And for my publishing side, I did focus on children's publishing, but right now I'm an editor in military and history publishing, so it's a little different. But yeah, it's still editing, it's still publishing, so same processes, I guess. Um, so today I wanted to discuss like world building, first drafts, and querying and other publishing things that have occurred for each of our panelists. But first, I wanted everyone to start off by introducing themselves. So, Kay, you're right next to me. So, would you like to start?
Sure. Okay. I'm going to hopefully be charmingly awkward. I haven't done a panel in a long time, but I'm Kale Walther. My first name is Kata. It's German for Catherine. I write contemporary YA with a lot of humor and heart and world building. I love my setting to be a character itself. So big fan of that.
Okay. Julie, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm Julie Eshbaugh. I write YA. I have 3 published novels so far, hopefully. The first 2 were a duology set in prehistoric times, Ivory and Bone and Obsidian and Stars. And then in 2019, I had a standalone fantasy, Crown of Oblivion, come out, all with Harper. It was Harper Teen. And then the executive editor on our editing team was given her own publishing house, well, her little inside house. So Quiltree is now, like, I guess the banner under which those books came out. So, and right now I'm working on a couple of things in YA and in middle grade. So I'm in the right place, I guess.
All right. How about you, Erin?
Hey, Megan. Hey, everyone. I'm Erin Entrada Kelly, and I write everything from picture books all the way through YA, but I'm best known for middle grade, especially Hello Universe, which won the 2018 Newbery Medal, and We Dream of Space, which won a Newbery Honor this year. Most of my books are realistic fiction, but I do have one fantasy novel that came out in, I think it was 2019. I teach I got my MFA at Rosemont, where I also teach on the faculty, and I also teach writing for children's and YA at Hamline University's MFA program.
Thank you. Okay, and Ruth, last but not least.
Hi, everyone. So nice to be here. I'm Ruth Behar, and so I write middle grade novels. I have 2 out so far, Lucky Broken Girl and Letters from Cuba. And so far, they've been focused in some way on my Cuban heritage in one way or another. And then the other interesting thing is I also have a background in anthropology. So before starting to write for kids, I wrote a lot of travel stories and travel books about my time living in Spain and Mexico and in Cuba that I've gone back to many times, to the place where I was born.
Awesome. So my first question is about world building. So for me, I've always, when I hear the world building, I automatically think of fantasy and science fiction. And I quickly realized over the years of writing that it applies to every genre. So my question for you is, what elements do you focus on when it's our own world that already exists and doesn't have to be made up, and that already has its own rules? And what rules are you comfortable with breaking, and what rules are kind of you're not allowed to break, I guess I would say. Kay, would you like to go first?
Sure. I have to think about this for a second. Well, I have to say I bow down to you, Julie, with the fantasy. I could never, ever write a fantasy book. Like, I come up with a concept and then it's like ... It's just never going to happen. But my settings so far, I have 2 books The first one is set at a boarding school. I went to boarding school, so that's kind of its own little bubble, its own world. So I kind of based it off of my school, where you have, it's not, you know, like the English building. The English building is named after somebody. So the school has its own type of jargon. And I simplified it a little bit, like the dining hall, it's just the dining hall instead of, you know, Irwin or Leighton or whatever. So I did keep some things, I simplified things, but I kept the jargon, the lingo, because it's such a big part. And these kids live at the school, so there was to make it interesting. There's a lot of rule breaking. You sneak out of your dorms after curfew, that type of thing. So I guess that's that. My second book, it's set on Martha's Vineyard. Again, kind of based on a real place. I like to write settings that are really close to my heart. And again, kind of a bubble of an island. And that I kept really true to the island. I tweaked some things to work with the story, but I did not do much here. But I like to bring places I love to life, and it's really fun for me, and it's been fun for readers. I know I'm not supposed to read reviews, but sometimes I can't help myself.
Okay, Julie, how about you? Well, you write fantasy, so you're completely starting from scratch. So what is that like?
It's true. Well, so here, you know, I have to give credit where it's due. I learned a lot about world building from a post on Melinda Lowe's website. So she has some writing instruction on her website, and I don't know when I found it or how long ago I found it, but when you mentioned the topic of world building earlier this week, I went and dug up my notes from Melinda Lowe, and then I made sure it's still available on her website. So she talks about, like, and she writes fantasy as well as realistic stories, but she talks about like 5 areas that you should think of when you're writing about world building, when you're making your world. But the one that always sticks with me, and the one that I know I have put a lot of thought to in my writing, is who has the power in this world? How did they get it? How do they keep it? Are they on thin ice with their power? Are they desperate to hold on to it? What does it mean to the people who don't have power? You know, your main character, is this a person who is in a place of power? Is this a person who is not? And what are those dynamics? And she talks about everything else. And she talks about food, and she talks about the rules of the world. But that power issue always stuck with me. And I think writing YA too, we write about character, and any really YA on down, we write about characters that, at least in some regard, are not in a position of power, obviously, because of their age. And that's one of the things I like about writing a younger protagonist, is that character is at least to some degree not autonomous, but also like they're often in a position where they're going to have to like take the lead at some point. Like in my first 2 books that are set in prehistory, I mean, first of all, I didn't even think of those books as fantasy until we were working with marketing, and I said, well, I don't really think of it. I think this is historical. But because there's so little known about prehistoric times, I mean, I did a ton of research, but even so, there's only so much that you can really know about what was happening in the Ice Age. So a lot of it is like my own ideas, and thereby it's fantasy. But I did give it a lot of thought about who's in power, because like my main character in the first book is a boy who's being groomed to become the clan leader. So that's a whole thing about power. So, I mean, yeah, I think you have to go from the top down, right? Like you have to know those questions, but you also have to know, like, what do people eat when they sit down, and how often do they sit down, things like that. And you said, what rules do we feel we can break? I can tell you, when I was writing that book set in prehistory, I'm fairly certain that people in prehistoric times did not have 3 meals a day like we do. But it was easier for me to like present the different times of day and the different like I am a 3-meal-a-day person. I think of like morning meal, midday meal, evening meal. And so that's the way my characters live in that book, even though I'm sure that's a bit of a stretch. And there's like another thing that I was so worried. It's so funny how what we worry about as opposed to what's really the thing that's going to be a thing. But those books are set on this continent, like the earliest people to set foot on this continent. And I had the story written, and before I realized in my research that there were no honeybees on this continent until the Europeans arrived. And honey is a big part of the story. And I thought, oh no, what am I going to do? And then I thought, you know what? I think that's a rule I can break. So, there's certain rules that you are entitled to break. And I really thought, believe it or not, now, years later, I have a better perspective on things, but I really worried that I would get called out on that. But I haven't been. But yeah, so I think that you do have to say, there are going to be parameters you're going to have to break out of. I know I'm like a big fan of Tana French's novels, the Dublin Murder Squad books. And I remember reading at the back of the first book I read that she's like, I did take some liberties, even though I did some research into how Dublin police investigate their murders. There is no Dublin Murder Squad. And the whole book, those books are all set around the Dublin Murder Squad, but she made that up. And I think that's okay. So I do think like that's a real world example of breaking the rule. So I think, you just have to make sure that you don't break a rule that if you didn't break it, the story would fall apart. I mean, like you want to make sure that the story would hold up in the real world, that you're being honest.
Yeah, that's interesting that you brought up the honeybees, because I've thought of writing historical fiction and I'm like, I don't know what animals were in America in like the 1600s and
yeah,
what was like extinct then, like what wasn't extinct.
Right. Yeah.
Their migration, like were they over here?
Well, I mean, I did do a ton of reading, and eventually I did read that, but it was too late. It was already built into the book. So, I mean, it's just, I could have changed it, but I felt like the book was strong. Like, I felt that fudging that made it a stronger book than if I had taken that out for the sake of realism, Also, who's to say that there weren't any honeybees? I mean, I think I found one reference to like some amber that has like a 100,000-year-old honeybee fossilized in it on this continent. So I suppose that's enough.
I read the book, Julie, and I never questioned the honeybees.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's a silly thing to worry about, but I know all of us are writers and we all worry about the silly things. So.
Yeah, because there could be one honeybee enthusiastic that
That's
reads
right.
your book and then it's like, no.
That's right.
Okay, so Erin, you've written one fantasy so far. So what is the differences that you took on those approaches with world building?
I would say the biggest difference with writing fantasy is obviously you have to think about how the society works and how currency works, what kind of jobs people have, how they get the things they need, and how that informs their daily lives. But once I had all that figured out for the fantasy, my process for world building on the page was pretty similar, which is always through my characters. So I'm very character focused. I believe there's nothing more important in our books or any book than the characters. So all my world building on the page happens through my characters. What is it like to walk around as my characters? I think about like, what do they see? What do they smell? What do they hear? What are they revealing to the reader and when? Because a lot of, with my students' manuscripts, one of the things that I see often is a lot of info dumping at the beginning because they want to like get the reader up to speed on what's happening in their world. But a more effective way to handle it is to introduce your reader to your world through your character's eyes. And a character is not necessarily going to stop near the bank of the river and reflect on how their world came to be, right? They're gonna unfold their world slowly to the reader. So that's how I worked with my fantasy, and that's how I do my contemporary as well. I think a lot about what is it like to walk around as my character, and I think too often writers think about their characters as chess pieces or like as not living, breathing beings. But when you sit and really think about what it's like to be them, the world, that's how the world building unfolds on the page. And, you know, then it happens organically, you know, whether it's fantasy or contemporary. Now, the biggest difference, I think, is with fantasy, the reader's only seeing the very tip of the iceberg of the world building that you have done. Because if you've done it properly, you've built a huge world, and the reader will only know small pieces of it, but you have to do that work on the front end, because everything that you know about your world will inform how your character walks around in the world, and it will inform every chapter and scene that you write. So you have to do the world building to prepare, and then use your characters to inform what that world looks like. So that's obviously with a school setting, with realistic fiction, you don't have to do a whole lot of time preparing necessarily, because you already have it, you know, and the real world has done a lot of the work for you, but you still have to world build through your characters. And I feel like for rules not to break, I mean, on a very practical sense, I think especially when we're adults writing about, whether it's 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds, however old they are, there we have a tendency to reflect on what life was like when we were that age and what our school life was like. And I think it's very important, especially for those of us who are many decades away from middle school and high school. Things are completely different now, right? So if your characters don't have any electronics, there needs to be a reason that makes sense. If a teacher is using a chalkboard and eraser, there needs to be a reason that that's in your world. It can't be because people used chalkboards when you were 10, because now they don't, right? It doesn't happen unless there's some reason why it's there in the school. So I think that as adults writing about children and young people, we have to remember that we know what it felt like to be 12, but we don't know what it's like to be 12 in 2021. So we have to remember like all those elements, and we have to understand what the world looks like, what the school world looks like for kids now, because it doesn't look the same as 1983, right? So I think that's a piece that a lot of authors who are writing, you know, well outside their age group tend to kind of forget.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Like, that I kind of want to come back to that later after we finish with this first half of world building. But Ruth, so your one novel takes place in Cuba. So what did you have to do with that?
Yeah, so my two novels, I'll talk about one and then the other. So the earlier one, Lucky Broken Girl, is based on my own life, and it's about a Cuban immigrant girl in New York in 1966. It's about a girl recently arrived from Cuba with her family. She's finally adjusting, and then the family's in a terrible car accident, and she ends up in bed for a year and has to figure out, I mean, talk about Julie's talking about like finding your power. She has to figure out, how am I going to find my power? You know, I'm in bed for a year. How am I going to make the most of this? And that actually happened to me. So that's the autobiographical part. So you would think it would be easy to write, but you really do need this kind of combination of memory and research and imagination, because, I mean, as Erin was just saying, you know, I mean, it's been a long time since I was 10 years old. So, you know, so to put myself back, you know, into that head of a child, you know, took definitely spending some time with young people and kind of like seeing like a 10-year-old girl today and kind of getting a sense of what it might be like to be a young person again, and to be like so vulnerable in a body cast for a year. But then I also had to do some research into the period, because it takes place in 1966, and that's been a long time too. And so I found out, you know, things that once I found them out, I remembered them from my childhood, like that the most popular song at the time was "These Boots Are Made for Walking." You know, that song came out in 1966. So the song is in the book. Go-go boots were a big deal. And then I started remembering, like, you know, dying for a pair of go-go boots, how much I, you know, wanted those. And so all of that historical exactitude kind of has to be there. But even when you're writing something realistic, there's an imaginative or even a fantasy element, because there's a moment in the book where the little girl, who's named Ruthie in the book, so the two hospital attendants that take her to the hospital have her cast changed every couple of months. They surprise her and they come on the first day of the year on January 1st, and they take her outside in a stretcher so she can enjoy the snow for a little while. And it's like a really beautiful moment. And so I wrote that. And when my mother read the book, she said, "Oh yeah, I remember that." And I said, "Mommy, that never happened. I completely made that up." She thought it had happened because the way I described it, it seemed real, but it was actually a fantasy. So that's where like fantasy can even enter into fiction that's auto fiction or realistic fiction. And now my more recent novel, Letters from Cuba, takes place in Cuba at the end of the 1930s, and it's about a Jewish girl from Poland immigrating to Cuba to try to help save her family. Her father is in Cuba, and he's only been able to make enough money to bring one of his children to Cuba. And so Esther says, I want to be the first to go. I'm a girl, but, please have faith in me that I'm going to help you. And so he does let her be the first to go to Cuba. And that's based on my grandmother's story. That was her story. But that was all I knew of her story. I didn't know what it was like to live in Cuba in the 30s. I didn't know, what it was like to be a young person arriving from Poland and suddenly having to learn to speak Spanish. There was just so much I didn't know. And then my family lived in a rural town in Cuba. So I set the novel in this rural town. But I had to go to the town myself, which I did, to kind of see this place and figure out how to set the story there. And I learned all these legends about the town as well that I incorporated into the story. So for me, there's always kind of this element of research, but I agree with Erin that you can't do the information dump, and I have to really watch myself because I'm so excited about all of those things, and I have to realize no, you've got to weave in the scenes, you've got to weave in the setting, you've got to weave in the historical moment, and really put us in Esther's head and through Esther in Letters from Cuba. And in fact, the book is written as a series of letters, and so you're in her head. She's writing these letters to her younger sister and kind of telling her about all of her experiences in Cuba. So I think also finding a form is very important. And for me with that book, it really helped to know that I was going to write an epistolary novel, that it was all going to be written as letters. And that structure really allowed me to tell the story, kind of just gave me a way of telling it. I think, Erin, you posted something about this, I think recently, about writing a sonnet. And I think when you're going to write a sonnet, you've got that template, that structure. And so for me, just knowing the whole book would be letters. Esther is going to write one letter after another to tell the story, and that's how we're going to get inside her head. That really helped me, knowing that I had a form in which to tell the story.
Okay, so my side question, I really didn't want to bring this up just because it's all we hear about, but as I was writing my question, I was thinking, they say to be careful putting pop culture in because it really dates your novel. But something that I've been thinking about is so when the pandemic first started, everyone was like, don't write about COVID. No one wants to read that. It's so upsetting. But now it's becoming such a normal thing to have to throw a mask on quickly. So when do you think it'll be appropriate to, or not appropriate, but we're going to have to put that in because it's almost an event like 9/11 that everyone born after that, the world was different, and that's how it is now. The world will never be the same. So from now on, everyone's going to either be born knowing about it or had experienced it. So when do you think have to include something like that? Maybe not it being solely about that, but just mentions here and there of how things are different now.
It depends. I think it kind of goes back to that. It goes back to the story and what the narrative needs and demands. And I think it also goes back to your characters and what the world looks like that they're walking around in. I think the big struggle with it is that we don't really know what the new normal is going to be. We kind of have an idea. Once COVID finally gets the hell out of here and we can forget about it, is the new normal going to be wearing masks? Is the new normal going to be hand sanitizer in every doorway? We don't know yet. So that makes it really tricky, I think. I have a book coming out in March. Here it is. And it, and I don't mention COVID at all, you know, but I know that a lot of authors are writing it into their contemporary books. I think it just depends. I think it really depends. And I don't know that there's like a blanket answer.
Yeah, because I feel like even if we're not wearing masks forever, I feel like if someone coughs or is sick, people will always be like, you know, have that first instinct to look at someone and be like, oh, you're coughing. So even just like small things like that, it's just definitely something we'll have to think about. But then it also could be something that disappears by next year and then it dates your novel.
It is so hard to know because a year ago, I would not have predicted that this year would feel like this. Like, and so I think whatever we guess next year will feel like, we're going to be wrong about it. You know, and so like, I get what you're saying, Erin, and especially as a person who knows from her own experience how long it takes for a book to come out. Like, you finish writing a book and you sell it, and then your publisher, I mean, this is how it is for YA. I don't know if it's any different for middle grade, but it takes 18 months from the time you sign your contract till the book is in the store. So that's a long time in the COVID world, right? Like, I'm thinking about what you just said, Erin, and how, you know, you probably wrote that book before there was any real reason to think about COVID. And you would have had to go back probably way at the end and say, oh, quick, let's put some references to hand sanitizer in. And you kind of hope that someday in the future, no one will look for that stuff in a book. So they'll go, okay, that makes perfect sense. I think if it's supposed to be right now, like if you are writing a book that is absolutely 2021, well, then it would be ridiculous if you didn't mention it. But if it's just like contemporary times, but not specifically now, I think, and like you said, Erin, it's so dependent. If your characters are living in a world where it doesn't matter, I mean, especially if it's their young children that maybe don't, if it's the summer or something, it might not matter to them at all. Because I've had times when I've walked my dog in the neighborhood in the summer and there's kids riding their bikes in my neighborhood and they act like there is no COVID. So, because to them there isn't. It doesn't matter in the middle of the summer and they're just playing with their brothers and sisters. So yeah, it's definitely a case by case thing, I think.
I feel like too, with at least with Fawn Creek, it's a school setting. It will still be a familiar setting because readers still know school. I mean, they're in school now. So I don't think anyone's going to be like, why isn't anyone wearing a mask in this classroom? You know, I don't think young readers will be thinking that. So I don't know. It depends on the story.
Okay, so and does anyone have anything else they want to say about world building? Or is everyone okay if I move on to okay. So I've noticed a lot that crossing genres and age categories is becoming a lot more popular for authors to do. Like before you would see an author write fantasy and then that was it. Like they never wrote anything else. But I think authors are really starting to explore. And I mean, that could be because publishers are finally letting them explore. And so something that I was thinking about when it comes to age groups is when you come up with a plot, are you thinking about the age category or does that come after when you make up the character to go with that plot? Because I mean, stories can happen, the same story can happen in every age group. And then the character is what changes how the story forms. So what comes first for you, the character in the age group or the plot, and then you find a character that fits for that plot, and then that's how it starts rolling for you. Erin, I'll ask you since you write picture books too, middle grade.
So for me, I have an easy answer, and all of my books have always started with the character. So I plot through my characters. I do everything through my characters, and however old that character is, that comes to me in my imagination in my brain, that will dictate what the book is going to be. So if the character is 12, well, more than likely that'll be a middle grade. If the character's 15, well, that feels like a young adult. So it all depends on the character, because I always think of the characters first. That's the first thing, you know, like some writers get a spark of an idea. Oh, I want to write a book about blah, blah. my spark is always a character, and so that's what dictates where the age group goes and what kind of manuscript it's going to be.
Okay. Kay, how about you? How do you decide?
My books always seem to start with the characters as well. This is, for some reason, I am always attached to 18-year-olds. My two books, the first, they were seniors in high school. So there are, bittersweet feelings there. It's your last year. You're going to college. What's that's going to be like? And then the character in my second book, it's a summer book, and she's just graduated high school. And, going to college for her is a big kind of struggle. Like, am I ready for college? It's fast approaching. So I am definitely more interested in the upper YA group.
Now, do you have a hard time with separating the upper YA with adult?
It's interesting. I personally do not. I mean, I think my second book, because it is the summer after she's graduated high school, does lean a little more adult. My publisher, Source Books, we never marketed it as a new adult book, but a lot of, again, I sometimes read reviews. A lot of people were under the impression that it was a new adult book when they bought it, and they're like, oh, it is YA. So I had to, reevaluate it. And I find that so funny. I'm like, I've never used the phrase new adult. My publishers never. I mean, and I think that's a compliment too, that I managed to capture kind of both.
Yes, it seems like new adult is more of a reader term
Mm-hmm.
than anything else. Ruth, how about you?
Yeah, well, for me, I really do have to know more or less the age of my characters before I can tell the story, because it's just going to determine a lot of aspects of what I'll write about, because what a 10 or an 11-year-old might experience would be very different from, say, a 14-year-old. So I've got to have kind of a sense in my mind of the age of the character. And I think the middle grade category is kind of interesting because it's that preteen age. So I think a lot of important transitions are happening during that time. And for me, I feel like it's an age that I can channel pretty well, because that was the time when I was in the body cast, when I was 10, 11 years old. And so that moment in my childhood is like very fixed in my brain somehow. And so it's kind of a voice that I feel I can write from, that sort of preteen voice, and I really like it. And it just kind of, I think it allows me, again, I think it sets certain parameters to kind of go back to that notion again, like I know that there's certain things that can happen at that age and other things that won't. And so it gives me also certain parameters to write from. And I think the imagination is also so strong at that moment for kids. So I really like writing from that perspective, though I do have a picture book coming out in January. So that's kind of my newest, adventure is writing for like a 5-year-old, say. So I was thinking, what would it be like to tell a story, that a 5-year-old might like? And it's about a girl and her relationship with her aunt, with her great aunt. And in the book, sometimes I feel that I'm the child, and sometimes I feel that I'm the aunt. I sort of feel myself in both those roles. But I would definitely love to see if at some point I could write kind of as which is just being said, like from the perspective an 18-year-old or kind of new adult, because I also look back to that period in my life, and it was also kind of a very strong moment, again, of so many changes. So I'd like to attempt that in the future.
I feel like the children's category as a whole, like including YA to picture books, is so difficult to come up with the age, just because no child, like when we're adults, and that's it. Like you don't transition into something else, but these kids are constantly all at different levels of maturity and all at different levels of reading, even just reading levels. So that it really is hard to, you got to focus on one audience once you do pick YA or middle grade, but at the same time, your audience is huge, because a middle grade could have 15-year-olds reading it because they're not as advanced, or they could have 8-year-olds reading it because, or 6-year-olds because they're extremely advanced.
Yeah,
So-
I think having said what I just said and hearing you speak now, there's another part of me that likes to say, well, I wrote this for middle grade, but it's really an ageless book, and I would love for anybody to be able to pick up and read it. And actually, it's a lot of fun when an adult reader writes to you and says, I know this is a book for kids, but I really enjoyed it. So I think that's kind of like the dream, like you're writing for a certain age group, but you're kind of hoping that it, that other people enjoy it as well beyond the age group too.
Right, because you want everyone to be able to read it, and adults, they're not like, oh, well, I hope a 5-year-old picks up my adult book. But for us, we're like, well, if an adult reads it, that'd be nice.
Exactly. I think that's exactly right. Yeah. And I think also regarding age, I mean, I think it is really different if you're writing about a character who's 40 or a character who's 65. I mean, we do as we get older, we're like at very, very different points in our lives as adults. So I think even adults, we don't divide up adult literature into all those categories, but potentially we could have like, here's the 40-year-old perspective, it would be very different from the 60-year-old perspective, but we tend to just, put all of adult literature into one big category.
Yeah.
Right. Julie, do you have any insight on like
Well, the only thing I would say is, I definitely think I was thinking about what Erin said about starting with the character. And for me, I think my character kind of goes along with the voice, and like I kind of find like I don't know, I'm always drawn to a really strong voice and when I read. And sometimes, like often I'll get an idea for something I want to write, but it's the voice that comes to me first. And then I think, what story is this person telling me? And the voice always tells you what age they are. I mean, like I think, obviously you can have a really spunky 10-year-old, a spunky 18-year-old, but you kind of know where they're coming from when you hear the way they talk in your head. And then, obviously too, you talk about that there are 10-year-olds who could read a YA. They're on that reading level. And I don't know if the rest of you who write YA have had this happen, but I've numerous times have been put in a situation where a parent will come up to me and say, my 11-year-old wants to read your book. Is that okay? And I feel like saying to them, like, I'm not your 11-year-old's mother. I don't know what you think is okay for your 11-year-old, because but what I actually say is there is violence, and there is sexuality, but not sex. And there is no bad words. I mean, that's what they want to know, which is really kind of strange. Like I always say, I always think to myself, your child, and that this book is written for like a 14 to 18-year-old. If your 10-year-old can handle a book that's written for a 14 to 18-year-old, and I've had 10-year-olds read Ivory and Bone and tell me they liked it. Sometimes I don't know if they really are going to understand some of the nuance, but that's all right. But I find that my readers are either kids, the people that the age range that it was written for, or grown-ups. And I'm fine with that because I read a ton of YA. So I know that a lot of YA is written for everybody who's a teenager up. I definitely remember, like, I'm thinking about what you guys were saying about how much you remember your youth. And like, I really remember being a teenager. I don't think I ever really forgot what that was like. To me, it's such a great time. And I got to tell you, one of the things I really feel strongly about is you have to just love the people you're writing about and writing for. Because I've had people say to me, oh, I can't stand teenagers. And yet they write for them. And I always think, like, she's like, can't imagine like feeling that annoyed by the people who I'm writing about and for. Now, it's very rare. I think it was probably a writer in a bad moment where they were just frustrated or something. But I know other people who don't write who tell me they can't stand teenagers. And I always think, well, it's a good thing they're not writing YA. So I don't know. I think there's a certain like connection we feel to the people we're writing about and the people we're writing for. And that kind of helps me decide what age I'm writing.
So Erin, I'll start with you for this next question. So you really did jump through all the age ranges. So the first time that you pitched to your agent or editor that you wanted to switch and get out of middle grade? What was their reaction to that?
Well, I think, well, I've never really gotten out of middle grade, so I'm pretty solidly in middle grade, right? But I think that middle grade is a good place to be because the other published books that I have under contract are picture books, and then I have Marisol, which is considered, it's pretty much a chapter book, but they call it lower middle grade because publishing in their categories. It's a good place to be because chapter books and picture books are very difficult to get published. It's a very, very competitive part of the industry. And as a middle grade author, you have kind of like this established readership. And a large part of that readership is librarians in middle grade. Unlike in YA, you know, well, librarians are important for every age group, but they're really important in the middle grade age group. And so I was able to go to chapter books and picture books. If I had started there, it would have been much more challenging because picture books are so difficult to write well and get published, and chapter books are as well because there's so much competition and it's a whole big thing. So I didn't really have trouble as far as that goes. And, you know, I was slightly concerned about going from realistic fiction to writing a fantasy. But my situation is a little atypical because I've been with the same editor and the same publisher through my career. And so we've really developed like a really close, trusting relationship. So she pretty much says, you know, just write the books that you want to write, that you need to write, and we'll be here supporting you and championing you. Of course, it helped that I won the Newbery Medal, right? I mean, let's be honest. They're kind of like, sure, you can write whatever you want now. So I like to think they would have said that anyway. But I think that there's a lot of navigating when you go across age groups. But I think that agents and editors really like when writers are able to be versatile in that way, because you're still speaking to the same reader, just at different points of their lives. So if you write picture books, chapter books, middle grade, and YA, you can pretty much follow a reader through their entire trajectory. You have a fan from like, you know, birth until forever. So I think it's actually a really good thing. Not that you have to be versatile, but I think it's a good thing when you're versatile. I think the only potential downfall is when you're starting out and you like, I want to write this and I want to write that and I want to write this, which is fine. But I think when you're out querying and like approaching editors and agents, it's good to have like a focus and then also be like, okay, this is my focus, but I also am interested in writing these other things, you know, like for me, for example, I'm very much a middle grade author. I think that's what I do best. That's what I'm best known for. But I also write chapter books and picture books and YA. But I'll always be kind of like, the middle grade is always kind of my focus. So I think it's good to have that focus and also be versatile if you can.
Okay, and Ruth, so you're working on a picture book. When you pitched that, did you have any pushback, or were they like, okay? Or did you have to get a new editor? Because I do know that sometimes they would rather you go with someone else just because they don't have the tools to publish a picture book.
Yeah, no, so that picture book, I mean, it's done. It's coming out in January. So, but then I have another one that's going to come out after that, that just recently sold, that actually I co-wrote with my son, the one that's going to be coming next. And that's like at the very beginning stages. But the one that's coming out in January, Tia Fortuna's New Home, it's called. I did end up going with a different editor for that book, but also within Penguin Random House. I think I had a lot of trouble writing the picture book, to be honest with all of you. You know, I thought it was going to be like writing a middle grade novel, but it wasn't. It was actually much more difficult because it was really like writing a poem. You know, it had to be perfect. I mean, you know, every word counts. You know, you have less than 1,000 words. you have to figure out at least for me, like how the words are going to be arranged on the page, like how the drama is going to build. And then you want it to be comprehensible to a very young reader who might be listening to the story rather than reading it themselves. So there were like a lot of new things to learn, but I do have a little bit of a background in poetry as well. And so I kept telling myself that I was writing a story in a poetic voice. And it was very, very difficult. I went through, one day I have to count all the drafts, but it was numerous drafts, and I kept revising and figuring out what needed to stay and what had to go. So it took quite a bit of effort. I was really surprised how much effort it took to write something so short. And you don't see the effort in the final product because you just think, oh, it's just the story, but actually to get it to flow took a tremendous amount of work. But I feel so proud of it because it was something I very much wanted to do. I love picture books, and there's so many picture books that I've read and enjoyed. And I really just wanted to tell this story for a very, very young person. And so it was kind of like a challenge to myself to see if I could pull it off. And then there's the beauty of then working with the artist. And that was such a joyful thing to do, because I had so many ideas for the art, and the artist was very, very open to receiving my ideas. And I sent a lot of pictures and images and various things that I hoped would, could be incorporated into the art. And she was very, very willing to incorporate all of those things. And it just turned out really beautifully. So I also love the idea of collaboration with an artist in picture books.
Julie and Kay, did you have anything to add about crossing genres or age groups?
No, well, I keep trying to kind of push this to the side because I'm nervous about it. But I actually co-wrote a middle grade book with my mother this summer as a project. And I did pitch it to my agent. And my agent has said again and again, whatever you write, I'm cool with. So she really loved it. And we've sent it out to editors now. So I'm trying not to think about it. But it was a lot of fun to write, but definitely an adjustment from YA. I write YA in first person. Here I switched to third because I love middle grade books, but I really prefer them in third person. So that was an adjustment. Working with my mom was interesting. We never thought, we raised our voices sometimes, but we never thought, and I love the end result. So my fingers are crossed there.
That's exciting.
And Julie, did you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I guess the only thing I would say is the only thing that popped in my head while I was listening to all of you is that it is true that, once you start writing in a particular age category, I think your agent and your editor are going to remind you have readers in that category. And the first time I said, maybe I'll write a middle grade. I think, luckily, my editor at Harper also does middle grade. So she was pleasantly open to it, but we haven't ever agreed on anything that I propose. So maybe she's not as open to it as I think. And another thing that I think I should just put out there is that I don't know, this isn't maybe the case with all, my agency is children up through YA, and that's it. That's the specialty of my agency. Now, I think most agencies probably do adult and child publishing, but a lot of individual agents don't. So it's a little tricky, I think I have only recently talked to my agent about possibly writing a novel for adults. I can't even get the words out of my mouth because it's such a weird thing. But and he didn't tell me that was crazy. But when I first signed with him, he told me if I ever wrote a novel for adults, he wouldn't be able to represent it. Now he has said, no, I have more connections in adult publishing now, so I think I could. And he says, if I couldn't, I'd let you know. And, you have to find someone else to represent it. But it's just something to keep in mind. It's just a strange industry in that it's sort of stratified that way. But I haven't found too many people give me real pushback about the idea of going outside of YA, even though, the other thing about YA and middle grade, although Erin, you mentioned librarians. I mean, with YA, your readership really are the people like the direct to consumer readers, and a lot of people grow out of YA. So I might have readers that aren't reading YA by the time I have another YA come out. So that's just something to think about too.
Okay. So to save time for questions at the end, I'm just going to skip to my last question, which was any advice that you have for querying. Ruth, do you want to start with that?
Wow. Well, just, be prepared for rejections. It happens to all of us. It happened to all of us. It definitely happened to me. And just, every time somebody turns you down, just view it as an opportunity to find the right person. That person wasn't right for you, wasn't a good match. Maybe tweak that query letter a little bit more, see what you can do to make it a little stronger, a little tighter, and just try again. You just really have to persevere and just have faith that the right person is out there for you. The person that's going to understand your work and support your work is out there.
Okay.
Yeah, I definitely agree that right person is out there. I adore my agent. Besides our working relationship, we are like best friends too. We have so much in common. So I'm grateful for finding a friend in her. Do not send all your query letters out at once. I didn't do this, but because I read a lot of blogs, but like Ruth said, you might have to tweak that query letter. So if you don't send out the letters in waves and just do one lump, you don't have the opportunity to do that.
Julie?
I mean, I know right now, getting back to the pandemic, I've heard from a lot of querying friends that everything's very slow right now. I mean, this is a slow industry to begin with, but even my agent was telling me that on his end, sending out submissions to editors, it slowed down a lot for the speed at which editors reply to submissions from him. And I'm hearing from, unagented authors who are submitting queries that it's also it's gotten even slower than the norm. And I think that's because we are in a time where people aren't really exactly sure where the industry is going to be in a year. Like, is it going to be ramping up? Is it going to be slowing down? I mean, I think patience is just such an important thing. I know the thing is, once you have an agent, you're going to have to be waiting again because it's going to be out on submission to editors and you're going to be waiting again. So always be writing the next thing so that you're not sitting around like, making yourself ill thinking about the fate of that book that you wrote. Just work on the next book so that you don't have to think about it. And also just don't take any of it personally, which is so easy for me to say, but it's so hard to actually do. But the truth is, I mean, it's a market. It's not about whether they think your book has value or whether you have value. It's whether they think they can sell that book in this market. And that's just a hard thing, and I think that I used to think when I first signed with my agent and we sent out some of my work and it didn't get accepted by certain like dream editors of mine, I thought that now that editor somewhere had a list that my name had been added to, people I don't want to work with. And my agent had to explain to me that is not how it works at all. He's like, somebody might read your work and go, I love this, but I cannot offer on it. And then they're anxious to read your next thing because they're learning that they like you and they like your writing. And it's the same way when you're querying agents. You could get a pass from an agent, but that doesn't mean you can never query that agent again with another project or even like a vastly revised version of the project they passed on. So that's always something to remember. It's not about you. It's about what they think they can sell.
It's good. That's good to hear for sure. Erin, how about you?
So I second what everyone else said. And I will say this, like, often we send out queries and then we writers, and then you might have like the first 10 or 15 pages or the first 50 pages in really, really good shape because that's what they see first. And I cannot tell you how many times I have read students' work where the first 10 to 15 page, or in Pitch Wars or in any kind of application program where I had to like judge something, where the first 10 to 15 to 20 to 50 pages are incredible, and the rest of the book completely falls apart. You can't just have a great first 50 pages. The whole book has to be good. So that's something to keep in mind too. When you go out to query, make sure your book doesn't fall apart after page 50. It has to stay good, or you're not going to get an offer.
Okay, so I just want to open it up to questions. So if any of you have questions, maybe type it into the chat and then we can read it and discuss that way. As everyone's like typing.
Or everyone's quiet.
Okay, how long did it take after querying for each of you to get an agent to offer?
6 months.
Julie, how about you?
It's hard for me to remember, which is terrible because it's been a while since I've been with my current agent. But I was actually with a different agent first. And I think we were very, like, she said she was interested, and then another, from my query, and she wanted to read, and then another agent wanted to read. And you get to a certain point where a lot of it comes down to how fast people read. And they always tell you, if someone else is reading and you get an offer, let me know so I can quickly read it and decide if I'm going to offer, which is all great, but it does take time. I'd say, okay, I would agree about 6 months maybe from the time that I started sending them out, but it can take years, even because like what Kay is saying is very true. You don't want to send them all out at once. You said that, Kay, right?
Yeah.
Did you say that? Yeah. Because I know some writers who have done that, and then they've made a change to the beginning of the story. They realize, oh, the front of the story is structured wrong, but it was too late. They had sent it to everybody already. So if you're doing that, if you're sending it to like 5 and then another 5 and then another 5, it can take a long time. You just have to be, but that is the nature of this industry. So you have to be ready to wait.
Erin put in the chat that it was 2 months for her, but she also said that, time varies for everything.
Yeah, it can take years, like Julie said. I think it depends too on the when you query. It makes a difference because a lot of agents will get swarmed right after NaNoWriMo, for example,
so true.
or they'll get swarmed, or like in August, a lot of publishing kind of shuts down. And so if you query in August, it may take a long time. It's all depending on so many things. And especially right now with the pandemic, things are taking longer. So it's like, it's hard to know based on 1 or 2 people's answers, because it depends on so much. And the book you're querying, maybe the market isn't responding well to those books now, but in 2 years you could get an agent in 5 minutes. I mean, it's just so dependent.
Okay, the next question is, traditionally your main character should grow throughout the story. So how dramatic should that change be?
I would say that it depends. Everything always depends.
Yeah.
It can be subtle. I mean, it just has to be like, who are they at the beginning versus who they are at the end, and they don't need to be a completely different person. They might just need to be someone who accepts themselves more as a person, if that makes sense. Like, they don't need to go from shy and scared to outgoing and big. It could just be like, oh, I'm a shy person, and at the end of the book, I'm still shy, but I'm okay with it. So It just really depends.
Yeah.
Definitely agree. I mean, one of the little things with my main character, my second book, it was like, I was completely dependent on my boyfriend at the beginning. And at the end, it's like, I like being my own person.
I would echo what Kay just said, because I feel like your story kind of has a central issue for your main character, and that thing probably should resolve at the end. Like if your main character is, I don't know, afraid that they can't live independently or step out on their own, or feels that, like my main character in Ivory and Bone is worried he won't be a good leader. If by the end of the book they either, well, hopefully they're going to be, they're going to know they can, or they're going to know they can't. And it resolves in one way or another. I think if that part of the character stays the same and that was the central issue, then your book has a bit of a problem. But I think if your character changes too dramatically, like I've read very popular books where, so I'm not going to say this is wrong. I know it just sometimes doesn't work for me. I've read books where the character is so different by the end. I go, I don't feel it. So I think, you know your character, what is the thing they're working on through the story, and that needs to change.
Okay, and then with the one last question is how large of a social media presence is needed to be published today?
Erin typed her answer in there.
Well, I was
I
trying to
agree
be
with Erin's
efficient
answer.
because time, time is coming. It's not that important. Please don't worry too much about it. If you don't like social media, you don't have to be on social media. If
I
you love
agree.
social media, then be on social media. I'm very active because I love it, but all that matters is you have a great book. So don't
I
stress
really
about
agree
social
with
media.
that, Erin.
Yeah.
Yes.
I also think some people work really hard at their social media presence, and I might get really jealous about how many followers they have on Twitter or Instagram or whatever, but it doesn't always translate to book sales.
No,
And
it's like a
so
nice to
what,
have,
I mean, do
but-
it if you like it, right? But don't do it because you think, I better get out there so that I can sell books, because I don't know how many people buy a book because they like your Twitter presence or your Instagram.
I also think they can tell when you're just trying to sell.
Yep.
And that
Well,
kind
that's why I always feel really inauthentic, because my publisher, of course, every publisher, I think, expects you to do something when the time comes. And I'm not a big social media person. So I always feel a little disingenuous when I'm out there like shilling for the book.
All right, well, this is great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you, Megan.
Yeah,
It was
this was
really
great.
fun,
Thank you
guys.
for
Thanks, everyone.
moderating. Thank you, everyone.